Jed checked his traps at dusk, never expecting to find a woman instead of game. Her wounds and fear raising questions. How did she end up in this forgotten canyon, and what horror drove her here? Night thickened, her pursuers' voices echoing in the mountains, and his solitude faced the blow of her mystery. This moment would force him to choose between peace and truth. Dive into this story to see how a stranger's past can shatter a hermit's life. Dust swirled around Jed's boots as he navigated the rocky trail, the canyon walls glowing crimson in the fading sunlight. His rifle rested heavy on his shoulder, its worn stock smoothed by years of use. He moved deliberately, eyes scanning the ground for signs of game, each step a practiced rhythm in the silence. The air smelled of pine and dry earth, sharp enough to sting his nose. At the canyon's base, his cabin stood, a squat, weathered structure of logs and mud, built by his own hands 12 winters ago. Every morning began the same. Coffee boiled over a fire, traps checked along the ridge, repairs made to whatever the wind or wolves broke. He skinned rabbits or deer when lucky, their hides stretched taut on frames behind the cabin. Nights were spent by the fire, the crackle of burning wood his only companion. People brought noise, lies, and trouble. Jed learned that lesson long before the mountains claimed him. He paused near a twisted juniper, checking a trap half buried in the dirt. Empty again, just like yesterday. His fingers traced the steel, testing its tension, while his mind wandered to the quiet he'd built. The world beyond the peaks, towns, saloons, lawmen, held nothing for him. He'd seen enough of men's greed and betrayal to know better. A hawk's cry echoed above, sharp and fleeting, pulling his gaze to the sky. This was his place, where silence ruled and no one asked questions. He turned back toward the cabin, unaware that tonight the mountains would betray his solitude. Twilight settled over the canyon, casting long shadows across the jagged rocks as Jed knelt beside his last trap. His fingers worked quickly, loosening the steel jaws, expecting another empty snare. Instead, he froze when a faint whimper cut through the stillness. There, tangled in ropes and slumped against a boulder, lay a woman, her clothes torn, blood crusted on her cheek. Her eyes, wide with terror, locked onto his, and her cracked lips moved, forming words he barely caught. "Please, don't tell them I'm here," she rasped, her voice raw, like she'd screamed for days. Jed's heart thudded, his instincts screaming to walk away. He'd seen trouble before, men running from bounties, women fleeing bad husbands, but this felt different. Her hands, bound tight with coarse rope, trembled as she tried to sit up. He scanned the ridge, ears straining for sounds of pursuit. Nothing yet, just the wind hissing through the pines. She looked half dead, her dark hair matted with dirt, but those eyes burned with something fierce, something alive. He crouched closer, keeping his rifle ready, studying her wounds, shallow cuts on her arms, bruises blooming purple across her neck. She wasn't caught in his trap. Someone had left her here, tied like an animal. "Who's after you?" he asked, his voice low, gravelly from disuse. She swallowed hard, glancing past him toward the darkening trail. "Men. From the camp. They'll kill me if they find me." Her words came in bursts, each one costing her breath. Jed's jaw tightened. He didn't want this, didn't need it, but the distant snap of a twig made his decision for him. Voices, low, urgent, carried on the wind, not far off. They were coming, and fast. He stood, gripping his rifle, knowing his quiet life was about to unravel. The canyon's shadows deepened as Jed led the woman toward his cabin, her uneven steps crunching gravel behind him. He kept his rifle low, eyes darting to the ridgeline where the voices had faded but not gone. Her name, she'd whispered, was Clara, and each word she spoke seemed to claw its way out. He didn't ask more, didn't want to. The weight of her presence already pressed against the walls of his solitude. His cabin loomed ahead, its weathered logs blending into the dusk, a sanctuary now at risk. Inside, he pointed to a stool by the fire, its embers glowing faintly in the hearth. Clara collapsed onto it, her bound hands shaking as she clutched her torn coat. Jed cut the ropes with his knife, the blade slicing through hemp with a soft rasp. Her wrists were raw, streaked with blood and dirt, and she winced as the air hit them. He turned away, busying himself with stoking the fire. but her wounds stirred something buried deep. Memories of his sister, lost to a fever, and a man's cruelty years ago. He shook off the thought, focusing on the present. Helping Clara meant trouble, maybe death. He'd built this life to avoid entanglements, to keep his hands clean of other people's wars. Yet, her shallow breathing filled the room, a reminder she wasn't just a shadow passing through. "You stay here tonight," he said gruffly, tossing a blanket her way, "but don't think I'm your savior." Clara nodded, her eyes fixed on the flames. "I don't expect saving," she murmured, her voice steady despite her trembling frame. "Just time to run." Jed's gut twisted. He knew hiding her was a choice, one that could cost him everything. Outside, the wind howled, carrying the faint echo of boots on stone. Time was running out, and he wasn't sure what he'd do when it did. The fire cast flickering shadows across the cabin's walls as Clara sat hunched, her hands gripping the blanket Jed had given her. He stood by the door, rifle in hand, listening to the night outside. No voices yet, but the air felt heavy, like a storm waiting to break. The wooden floor creaked under his boots as he paced, his mind wrestling with the stranger now sitting in his world. Clara's presence was a crack in the life he'd built, and every glance at her bruised face widened it. She spoke first, her voice low but steady, cutting through the silence. "They took me from a wagon train 8 days ago," she said, staring into the flames. "Thought I'd fetch a price in some mining camp." Her words came in fragments, each one sharp with pain but laced with defiance. "I fought. Got these for it." She lifted her wrists, the raw skin catching the firelight. Jed's jaw clenched. He didn't want her story, didn't want to care. But the image of her fighting, alone, hit him like a stone. He turned to the window, peering through a gap in the shutters. The canyon was dark now, stars sharp against the sky, but he felt eyes out there, watching. "How many are after you?" he asked, keeping his voice flat. 5, maybe 6, she answered, her tone hardening. "They don't quit easy." She paused, then added, "I killed one to get away." Jed's head snapped toward her. Her eyes met his, unyielding, no trace of shame. This wasn't some helpless drifter. She'd survived hell and carried the weight of it. His own past stirred again, choices he'd made, lives he couldn't save. He wanted to send her away, to keep his hands clean. But her resolve, that steel in her voice, made him question his own. The fire popped, spitting sparks. Outside, a wolf howled, and Jed knew the night wouldn't stay quiet much longer. Morning light crept through the canyon, painting the rocks in pale gold, as Jed crouched by the stream near his cabin. He dipped his hands into the icy water, washing away the grime of yesterday, but his eyes scanned the muddy bank for tracks. There, fresh boot prints, 2 sets, pressed deep into the soft earth near a cluster of willows. His stomach tightened. Clara's pursuers were closer than he'd hoped. He stood, wiping his hands on his worn jacket, and glanced back at the cabin where she slept, still wrapped in his blanket. He hadn't slept, his mind caught between her story and the life he'd sworn to protect. Her words from last night echoed. 5 or 6 men, relentless, hunting her like game. Jed knew men like that, driven by greed or pride, and they didn't stop until blood was spilled. He crossed the clearing, his boots silent on the pine needles, and checked his rifle, counting the cartridges in his pouch. 10. Enough, maybe, if it came to a fight. Clara stirred as he entered, her eyes snapping open, wide with fear. "They're here, aren't they?" she asked, her voice hoarse but sharp. Jed nodded, pointing to the window. "Tracks by the stream." "They're circling," looking, her face paled, and she stood clutching the blanket like a shield. "We need to go now, higher into the mountains," she said, her words tumbling fast. "They'll burn this place if they find me." Jed's chest tightened. Leaving meant abandoning his home, his traps, the quiet he'd bled for. But her fear, raw and real, pulled at him. He saw his sister's face again, her lifeless eyes from years ago, and cursed under his breath. "Pack light," he said, tossing her a sack. "We move at noon." He didn't want this fight, but standing still wasn't an option anymore. The canyon, once his refuge, now felt like a trap closing around them both. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist as Jed and Clara moved swiftly along a narrow trail winding up the canyon slope. His pack weighed heavy on his back, stuffed with essentials: flint, dried meat, a spare knife, while Clara carried a small bundle, her steps uneven but determined. Pine branches brushed against them, snapping softly, and the air grew thinner, sharper, as they ascended. Jed's eyes flicked to every shadow, every rustle in the underbrush, his rifle gripped tight. The tracks by the stream haunted him. Those men weren't far, and they weren't amateurs. Clara's breathing was ragged, her face pale under the dirt and bruises, but she kept pace, clutching the sack he'd given her. He hadn't asked more about her story, didn't need to. Her defiance last night, admitting she'd killed to escape, told him enough. She wasn't running from a single mistake. She was running from a nightmare. Jed's own past gnawed at him, memories of his sister's broken body, left behind in a town that didn't care. He pushed the thought down, focusing on the trail's loose rocks, the faint path leading to a high ridge. They stopped at a rocky outcrop, catching their breath behind a cluster of boulders. Jed scanned the canyon below, its vastness swallowed by heat haze. Then he heard it. Low voices carried on the wind, no more than a quarter-mile down the slope. Clara froze, her hand gripping his arm. "They're close," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They'll find us." Jed's pulse quickened, but he kept his face stone-cold, pointing to a narrow crevice in the rock face. "Get in there." "Stay low," he said, his tone sharp. She hesitated, her eyes searching his, then nodded and crawled into the shadowed gap, disappearing among the stones. Jed stepped onto the open trail, rifle ready, his boots crunching deliberately to draw attention. Two men appeared below, their hats low, rifles slung across their chests. The taller one, with a scar slicing his cheek, called out, "You seen a woman, mountain man?" Young, dark hair, likely scared. His voice was smooth, but his eyes were hard, like a wolf sizing up prey. Jed's grip tightened on his rifle. "Ain't seen nobody," he said, keeping his voice steady, though his heart pounded. The second man, shorter, with a patchy beard, stepped closer, his hand resting on a pistol. "Mind if we look around?" he asked, his smile more threat than question. Jed stood his ground, the canyon silence pressing against them. Every second felt like a fuse burning down. The canyon air hung thick with tension as Jed faced the two men, their boots scuffing the rocky trail below the ridge. The scarred man's eyes narrowed, studying Jed's weathered jacket and the rifle held steady in his hands. Behind him, the shorter one shifted his weight, fingers twitching near his pistol, a smirk playing on his lips. Jed kept his stance wide, rooted to the earth, his face a mask of calm despite the pulse hammering in his throat. The crevice where Clara hid was just steps away, concealed by jagged rocks, but he felt her presence like a weight on his chest. "I told you, ain't seen no woman," Jed said, his voice low, deliberate, each word chosen to keep them at bay. He tilted his head slightly, letting his gaze drift past them to the canyon's edge, as if he had nothing to hide. The scarred man spat into the dirt, his rifle shifting in his grip. "You live out here alone, old man?" he asked, his tone probing, like a blade testing for weakness. "Folks like you see things, even if you don't want to." Jed's fingers tightened on his rifle, the wood warm from his grip. He knew this game. Men like these didn't ask questions for answers. They asked to measure your nerve. "Just me and the wolves," he replied, meeting the man's stare. "If your girl's out here, she's coyote food by now." The lie tasted bitter, but he held it, watching the shorter man's smirk fade. The scarred one stepped closer, his boots grinding gravel, and pointed down the trail. "We'll take a look ourselves then. No offense." Every muscle in Jed's body tensed, but he didn't flinch. He shifted his weight, blocking the path to the crevice, his rifle still low but ready. "Suit yourself," he said, nodding toward the open canyon. "But you're wasting daylight." The shorter man chuckled, a dry, ugly sound, and glanced at his partner. "He's hiding something," he muttered, his hand now resting on his pistol's grip. The air crackled, like the moment before a storm breaks. Jed's mind raced. Draw now, and it's a fight. Wait, and they might find her. Seconds stretched, each one a gamble with their lives. The canyon silence swallowed the men's footsteps as they turned away, their shadows stretching long across the rocky trail. Jed stood motionless, his rifle still gripped tight, watching the scarred man and his partner disappear around a bend of twisted pines. His heart pounded, but he kept his breath steady, ears straining for any sign they'd double back. Clara's crevice was hidden, tucked behind boulders dusted with lichen, but the weight of her presence pressed against him like a storm cloud ready to burst. He waited, counting seconds, until the wind carried only the rustle of leaves. He moved to the crevice, kneeling low, his voice a harsh whisper. "They're gone, for now." "Come out." Clara crawled free, her hands trembling as she brushed dirt from her torn coat. Her eyes met his, wide and searching, reflecting the fading light. "You didn't have to lie for me," she said, her voice soft but heavy with something unspoken. "You could have handed me over." Jed's jaw tightened. He didn't answer, just gestured for her to follow him back toward the trail's edge. They sat behind a slab of granite, hidden from view, the canyon sprawling below like a painting of dust and stone. Clara's fingers clutched the sack he'd given her, knuckles white, and she stared at the horizon. "I've been running so long, I forgot what standing still feels like," she said, her words raw, like she was confessing to the mountains. Jed looked at her, seeing not just the bruises but the fire in her eyes, the same fire he'd seen in himself before the world broke him. He shifted, uncomfortable with the pull of her words. "Don't owe you nothing," he said, his voice gruff, but it lacked conviction. Her gaze held his, steady and unflinching. "You're here, ain't you?" she replied, a faint challenge in her tone. The words hung between them, forging a bond neither wanted but couldn't deny. Jed turned away, scanning the canyon again, knowing those men weren't done. The air felt heavier now, charged with the promise of trouble, and he sensed the quiet he'd cherished was slipping through his fingers like sand. Dusk settled over the canyon, cloaking the jagged peaks in a haze of purple and gray as Jed crouched near a rocky overhang, his eyes fixed on the valley below. Pinpricks of orange light flickered in the distance, campfires no more than a mile away, where Clara's pursuers had settled for the night. The air carried the faint scent of burning wood, mingling with the sharp tang of pine and dust. Jed's fingers tightened around his rifle, the cold metal grounding him as he calculated their odds. 5 or 6 men, Clara had said, armed and relentless, now camped close enough to choke his sense of safety. His cabin, his refuge, felt like a distant memory, left behind when they fled higher into the mountains. Clara sat beside him, her back against a boulder, her knees drawn up under the blanket he'd given her. Her face, streaked with dirt and bruises, was taut with exhaustion, but her eyes stayed sharp, scanning the horizon like a hunted animal. She hadn't spoken much since their encounter on the trail, but her silence wasn't weak. It was the quiet of someone who'd learned to survive by listening. Jed glanced at her, his mind wrestling with the choice he'd made. Helping her was a chain around his neck, pulling him into a fight he'd spent years avoiding. Yet turning her away felt wrong, like betraying the ghost of his sister, whose face still haunted his dreams. "We can't stay here," Clara whispered, her voice cutting through the evening's hush. She pointed toward the campfires, her hand steady despite the tremor in her breath. "They'll move at dawn, maybe sooner." "We need to keep climbing." Jed's gut twisted. The higher trails were treacherous, narrow ledges, loose shale, and winds that could knock a man off a cliff. He'd hunted there alone, but with her, wounded and slowing, it was a gamble. "Running blind at night's a death sentence," he said, his voice low, rough from the cold air. "We'd break our necks before they even find us." Clara turned to him, her eyes fierce in the dim light. "I'd rather fall than let them take me back," she said, each word deliberate, carved from some deep well of resolve. "You don't know what they do to people like me." Her voice cracked, just for a moment, and Jed saw the weight of her past in the lines of her face. He wanted to ask, to know what kind of hell she'd escaped, but the question stuck in his throat. Instead, he looked away, toward the campfires, their glow a taunt in the growing dark. He stood brushing dirt from his knees and checked his pack. Flint, a coil of rope, enough jerky for 2 days. His cabin was gone to him now. Those men would tear it apart if they traced their path. The thought stung, but Clara's presence, her stubborn will to live, stirred something in him he'd buried long ago. "We'll move at first light," he said finally, his tone firm but softer than he meant. Get some rest." She nodded, pulling the blanket tighter, but her eyes stayed on the fires below, as if daring them to come closer. Jed settled against the rock, rifle across his lap, knowing sleep wouldn't come. The night was too alive with danger, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of another's life tethered to his own. The moon hung low, casting a pale glow over the rocky ledge where Jed and Clara sat, the canyon's silence broken only by the distant crackle of the pursuers' campfires. The air was sharp, biting at Jed's knuckles as he cleaned his rifle, its barrel glinting faintly in the moonlight. Clara huddled nearby, her blanket pulled tight, her eyes fixed on the dark trail they'd climbed. Her breathing was steady now, but her hands betrayed her, twisting the edge of the fabric into knots. Jed watched her from the corner of his eye, her resolve clashing with the fear she couldn't hide. His own thoughts churned. Every choice he'd made since finding her had drawn him deeper into a fight he didn't want. Inside the overhang's shadow, Clara's voice broke the quiet, low and urgent. "If they catch me, I won't go back alive," she said, her words slicing through the cold air. "I'd rather throw myself off this ridge than let them touch me again." Her tone was fierce, but her eyes glistened, betraying the cost of her defiance. Jed stopped wiping the rifle, his hand still, the cloth dangling from his fingers. He'd heard that kind of desperation before, in his sister's voice, years ago, when she begged him to run from a man who'd broken her. He hadn't listened then, and the guilt still carved at him like a dull blade. "Don't talk like that," he snapped, his voice louder than he intended, echoing off the rocks. "You ain't dying, not tonight." The words surprised him, raw and forceful, as if someone else had spoken them. Clara's head turned, her gaze locking onto his, searching for something he wasn't sure he could give. "Why do you care?" she asked, her voice softer now, almost a challenge. "You don't know me. You could have walked away." Jed's jaw clenched. He had no answer, not one he could say aloud. Her question hung heavy, stirring memories of choices he'd failed to make, lives he couldn't save. He stood, pacing to the edge of the ledge, his boots crunching on loose shale. The campfires below flickered like eyes in the dark, their glow a reminder of the men waiting to kill or worse. "I ain't your hero," he said finally, his back to her, his voice rough, "but I won't watch you get dragged off." Clara didn't respond, but he felt her eyes on him, heavy with something unspoken. Gratitude, maybe, or doubt. The wind picked up, carrying the faint sound of laughter from the camp below, cold and mocking. Jed gripped his rifle tighter, knowing the morning would bring more than words. For the first time in years, he wasn't just fighting for his own survival, and the weight of it settled deep in his bones. The night shattered with a crack of gunfire, the sound ripping through the canyon like a whip. Jed lunged for cover behind a boulder, his rifle already raised, as torches flared into view below the ledge. Clara scrambled beside him, grabbing a hatchet from his pack, her eyes wide but fierce in the flickering light. Shouts echoed, harsh guttural voices of men closing in, their boots pounding the rocky trail. The campfires they'd watched earlier were gone, replaced by the glow of 5 torches weaving through the darkness, their bearers moving fast. Jed cursed under his breath. He'd underestimated how quickly they'd strike. "Stay down," he hissed, pressing Clara against the rock, his hand firm on her shoulder. Her breath came in sharp gasps, but she nodded, gripping the hatchet until her knuckles whitened. The air smelled of pine and gunpowder, the cold biting at Jed's face as he peered over the boulder. 3 men were visible now, their silhouettes sharp against the torchlight. Scarred man in front, his rifle raised, 2 others fanning out with pistols drawn. "Come out, mountain man," the scarred one bellowed, his voice thick with menace. "We know you've got her." Jed's heart pounded, but his hands were steady, lining up a shot. He fired, the rifle's roar splitting the night, and one of the pistol-wielding men dropped, clutching his leg. Chaos erupted, shouts, return fire, bullets chipping stone around them. Clara flinched but held her ground, her hatchet raised like a shield. Jed reloaded, his fingers swift despite the chaos, and fired again, grazing the scarred man's arm. The man cursed, dropping his torch, but didn't fall back. "You'll die for that," he roared, signaling the others to advance. Clara's voice cut through the noise, low and urgent. "We can't hold them here," she said, her eyes darting to the trail leading higher. Jed knew she was right. The ledge was exposed, and more men were likely circling. He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward a narrow path snaking up the cliff. Bullets whizzed past, one grazing his pack, tearing fabric. They ran, stones skittering underfoot, the torchlight fading as they climbed. The fight wasn't over, just delayed, and Jed felt the weight of every choice that had led him here, standing between Clara and men who'd kill without blinking. Dawn broke over the canyon, its pale light spilling across the blood-streaked rocks where the fight had ended. Jed stood in the doorway of his cabin, rifle still warm in his hands, his breath visible in the cold morning air. Clara leaned against the wall beside him, her hands trembling but steady enough to grip the hatchet, now stained with blood. The ground near the smoldering campfire was littered with 3 bodies. Scarred man among them, his eyes staring blankly at the sky, a bullet hole in his chest. 2 others had fled, their shouts fading into the dawn as they ran down the canyon slope. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the wind whistling through the pines. The fight had been brutal, a blur of gunfire and steel. Jed had taken a grazing shot to his shoulder, the pain sharp but bearable, blood seeping through his torn shirt. Clara had fought like a cornered wolf, swinging the hatchet when one man got too close, her strike catching his arm before Jed finished him. Now, as the sun climbed, she stood tall despite her exhaustion, her face a mix of relief and something darker. Grief, maybe, for the life she'd lost long before this night. Jed watched her, his own chest tight with a feeling he hadn't known in years, connection, unwanted but undeniable. He stepped forward, kicking dirt over the dying embers of the campfire, his boots scuffing the earth where blood had soaked in. "They won't stop," Clara said, her voice low, steady despite the tremor in her hands. "The ones who ran, they'll bring more." Jed nodded, his gaze sweeping the canyon's rim, half expecting shadows to emerge. He'd killed for her, crossed a line he'd sworn never to touch again. His cabin, his solitude, his carefully built world. It was all shattered now, scattered like the ashes at his feet. "You can still run," he said, his voice rough, avoiding her eyes. "I'll hold them off if they come back." Clara shook her head, stepping closer, her hatchet clattering to the ground. "I'm done running," she said, her words firm, carved from the same steel that kept her alive. "And you're not alone anymore." Her eyes held his, fierce and unguarded, and for the first time Jed felt the weight of his loneliness lift, replaced by something heavier, responsibility, purpose. The canyon stretched before them, vast and unforgiving, but they stood together. 2 survivors bound by a night that had changed everything.